So I never thought I'd actually be reviewing a HorusHeresy Primarchs novel, but here I am. And honestly, you guys, I would say this right now, I actually finished this book in like a day. As this one rounds out to about a nice 183 chapters, but in a very nice hardback too. So, let's talk about it. So, Blood of the Emperor is essentially a short anthology that has 6 different short stories revolving around 6 of the 18 Primarchs, aka the Emperor's children. So, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to cover each different short story that's within this book. I'll tell you guys right now, this one was actually a very interesting read. I managed to get through this again in like a single day because it's a short book. But it was also fascinating to see each of the different Primarchs, see some of their perspectives, like some of their past, some of their motives, their actions during the Great Reclamation of the Galaxy, I want to say. But it was actually fascinating, again, to see all these different Primarchs, and some of them were horrifying, some of them were enlightening, some of them were just straight up crazy. But, in the meantime, let's get to talking about them. So the first story in this book is called Lupus de Manus by Graham McNeill. And as a matter of fact, it actually covers a very key character within Warhammer history, Horus Lupercal. And this actually covers a bit of his early childhood, back when he was growing up on a planet before he joined the Imperium. Back then he was actually known as Nergui, which in his culture meant no name. And it's actually fascinating to see how Horus became more of the man that he is, because the planet that he grew up on was essentially a dead world where it was essentially survival of the fittest. They could not live above ground due to the high levels of radiation from the sun beating down on the planet, so they were all forced to live in these underground caverns, essentially because that's the only place that they could live, and because their world was actually just a dead mining world. And it was actually interesting to see just how this whole survival of the fittest thing came about. Like, once you made your first real kill, you would earn the right to a name. And it shows Horus, or as he was known then, Nergui, trying to earn his name somehow, and trying to live up to the expectations of his father figure back then, who was also his tribal leader, who may not have been the best father figure, if I'm going to be completely honest with you guys. You'll just have to see what I'm talking about as you read the story, but it actually includes a lot of fun things. Like at one point, it actually mentions how Horus's first ever kill was, in fact, just from what I'm seeing here, it looks like it was a member of the Adeptus Mechanicus that he killed first. And that's actually fascinating. His first kill wasn't a human being, but it was in fact a Adeptus Mechanicus member, which makes it a bit more fascinating in how he earned his name of Horus, the culture he grew up in, so it's really no wonder that Horus wound up turning dark later on. But while it was interesting seeing some of Horus's past, the other Primarchs definitely had some very interesting stories themselves. Let's talk about the rest of them. Next up we have Scald by Nick Kyme, a Lehman Russ short story. So this whole story takes place with a group of hunters who are tracking down a creature that has essentially been responsible for slaughtering multiple villages across the planet of Fenris, which, for those of you who are Warhammer knowledgeable, is the home planet of Lehman Russ, Primarch of the Space Wolves. And personally for me, guys, some of my favorite factions have either been the Chaos Marines, but concerning the regular Space Marines, my favorites either have to be the Space Wolves or the Thousand Suns. Mostly just because they each have a very fascinating story, with the Space Wolves essentially being just space Vikings, all things considered. So this group of hunters keeps following the trail of this creature that they're following, and they each have a short story that they tell around the fire about the Russ, as they call them, each coming up with very different stories, such as how one says that he was a giant, one says that he was just a mutant wolf. and each of them get it wrong, but they're getting very close. So in the end, they come to this absolutely desecrated village, where they find this absolute giant of a man, and who the audience will realize is actually Leman Russ. But these hunters don't know that, so they have him join him on the quest, till eventually they find a wolfen. And then it starts to piece together that this is actually his child, that this is Leman Russ, when you see the look on the man's face when he sees his dead son. Well, injured, dead, and dying. Now, for those of you who don't know, a wolfen is essentially someone in the Space Marine Legions who did not survive the process of, what was it? Essentially, it's like taking in the wolf blood, where the senses become sharper, or where they become stronger. But if your will is not strong enough, then you will evolve into a wolfen, half man, half wolf. But eventually, they run across what's been responsible for slaughtering the villages, which was a massive pair of demons. But during this hunt, Leman actually pretty much gives away his identity as to who he is, as Leman Russ, a former king who was challenged by the Emperor of Mankind to join him on his quest to reclaim the galaxy. And Leman run all challenges but one against the Emperor. And because of that, he threw down his sword and swore to serve the Emperor as of that point. And by the end of it, after the battle of killing these demons, we essentially see the Space Wolves dock on the surface of the planet, pick up Leman Russ, and thus the one man who has survived this whole entire hunt now has a new story to tell, of the Russ, as they call him. I gotta tell you guys, this whole story was actually really fun to read, just because it's like that simple hunt for this simple creature, plus the folk tales, the hunting in the snow, that whole survival type of story. It was actually pretty good. It really grabbed my attention all the way through. And it was actually pretty fun to see a bit more of Leman Russ, especially the Space Wolves themselves. Now that was a bit more fun. I have the Sagas of the Space Wolves omnibus, which I will definitely be covering that at some point after I finished it. So you all know that I'll be looking forward to that. Or I might even just pick up the Leman Russ novel of the Primarch series, but I'm getting off topic here. I'm sorry, guys. Let's move on to the next story. Next story, and the third in the anthology, is The Sixth Cult of the Denied by David Geimer. And this one actually drew my attention even more because it was a Thousand Suns story revolving around Magnus the Red. So, if I'm going to be honest with you guys, the Thousand Suns I view as one of the best story-wise when it comes to the Chaos Marines, because of the fact that their story is essentially that of a tragedy. I mean, think about it. The Thousand Suns were essentially a massive group of scholars and learners of the warp, and that was their only thing. They sought to gain knowledge of the warp and the arcane, as well as building up massive amounts of, well, books of knowledge and everything else. They were just a cult of scholars, which makes their fall to chaos all the more tragic, and especially the fall of Magnus the Red. But the story actually goes to show that Magnus was definitely aware of the sentience within the warp, aka the 4 chaos gods that resided in the warp. So this whole story revolves around one other person seemingly making contact with the sentiences within the warp, making contact with the chaos gods, essentially. So he goes to meet this council, where Magnus is the head, and each one being a different branch of study. However, Magnus essentially stops time right before then, confronts the person who has made contact, and reveals that he has also done the same. sacrificing his eye for greater knowledge of the warp. And at first, I gotta tell you guys, I thought it was just this one scholar that had done it. But as a matter of fact, I realized that I was actually reading a bit of Magnus's thought process when he himself made contact with the Chaos Gods of the Warp and sacrificed his eye to gain further knowledge of it. But seeing that Magnus is also trying to keep this under wraps shows that he is still loyal to the Emperor at this time, and because the Emperor has decreed that chaos cannot be seen, or that Magnus is trying to keep it secret about the Chaos Gods and everything else within the warp. And to see that, this one scholar essentially being driven mad with the fact that he's trying to prove his gene father wrong and prove himself right at the end of the story, just goes to show that the Thousand Sons are essentially a tragedy in story format. The fall of a great civilization of scholars, just like that, due to betrayal, even from within their own ranks. But all in all, I'd say this one was definitely good, but I would advise taking a break after the story, as some of these were, as one thing you forget about scholars is that they can be very verbose. So I would advise anyone who's reading this book to at least take a break after this third story. Just like take a break, get some water. Especially after this one. But again, I really like this one because it gives more of the Thousand Sons back when before their fall to chaos, and essentially Ahriman's rubric, which turned a good 80% of the Legion to dust. Which again proves my point of just this whole thing being a tragedy, but also the denial of chaos at that point. Like making sure that keeping everything quiet about how there are sentiences, how there's sentient life within the warp, sentient intelligence, the Chaos Gods, that, where do I put it? That persuasive and corrupting force is the best way to put it. The fact that they are aware of it just makes it all the more insane in my mind. But I'm probably babbling here. Let's move on to the next one. Next up, we have The Will of the Legion by Andy Clark. This one actually caught my attention because it was a Rogal Dorn and Imperial Fists story. These are guys I rarely ever hear about, except maybe in the omnibuses of the Crimson Fists or the occasional Black Templar story. I have never really read anything involving the Imperial Fists. But this actually gave me an idea of how they worked, how they fought as one legion. But most importantly, guys, I'm going to say this right now. Rogal Dorn is terrifying. Okay? He is straight up terrifying because so this whole story revolves around them finding this asteroid space station which has not been a part of the Imperium, and they're essentially expanding out, but these guys made the big mistake of firing upon the ship owned by Rogal Dorn and the Imperial Fists. So they deploy to the station, and Rogal makes a straight spearhead charge towards the environmental controls, which controls everything from the artificial gravity to life support to oxygen, everything else. After taking down so many people, he tells the survivors either they submit to the Imperium or he's going to shut down all the environmental controls. And it's just like, I'm just reading this, and I was absolutely shocked at that point. I did not realize that Rogal Dorn himself could be that terrifying of a character. Essentially, he's saying, submit to the Imperium or die. And this whole story actually takes place from the perspective of one of his Imperial Fist Space Marines, who is watching this whole scenario play out before his eyes and wondering if he can really go through with that order, or if he'll be forced to due to his genetic coding to obey his Primarch. And just seeing a Space Marine questioning that, as well as listening to Rogal Dorn's actions, makes you really wonder, would you really want to serve under somebody like that? Somebody that is ruthless as Rogal Dorn? Granted, I don't know much about the guy himself. I might need to pick up one of his novels just to see more of his backstory, to understand how he is this stern and unyielding of a character. But again, Rogal Dorn left me a bit shook, I'm not gonna lie. But all in all, this was actually a very good piece to kind of get the ball rolling. Instead of these subtleties of court between a council or a simple hunt or a fight for survival, this was just a straight up confrontation mini war zone type that's pretty much familiar to 40k fans. But it really does have that questioning doubts of whether you would be willing to follow all the orders that are given to you, despite your own moral compass. And that was actually pretty fascinating to see. I might need to pick up more about the Imperial Fist sometime for their lore. But I'm babbling here. Let's get to the next one. So next up we have Council of Truth by Mike Brooks. This was the second to last story in the anthology. This also takes place during the Great Crusade, or the Great Reclamation, something along those lines. But this one actually takes place from the Alpha Legion, a Chaos Space Marine faction that I'd never read any kind of lore about. Like, I hear scraps of them, but I've never actually read a story about them before, especially not about their Primarch, Alfarius Omegon. So this one was definitely a quick surprise for me, because I had never seen anything about the Alpha Legion before. So, essentially, the Council of Truth storyline revolves around how Alfarius Omegon is in a private session with some of his commanders, and the whole council has to take a vow of truth within that room. You speak only the truth and nothing but the truth, essentially. So Alfarius was essentially called out by Robot Gilliman, the Primarch of the Ultramarines Space Marine Legion, saying that his work is going very, very slow, and he hasn't conquered as many planets as some of the other Primarchs. And we actually see that Alfarius has a very different tactic. Instead of just charge straight ahead, we use overwhelming force. And the Alpha Legion essentially is very, very crafty in their works. They work to disable all the key points of interest, like cutting off the power, tearing down supplies, disable the defenses. They play it tactically, with sneak attacks and spreading their forces to every other key locations. They don't play it like a straight charge. They play it with tactics, and that just makes Alfarius a very fascinating character. He chooses to be outside of the mold himself, realizing that while others might underestimate him, he is playing the long game. And in a way that actually reminds me of Grand Admiral Thrawn from the Star Wars books. How he plays tactically. He doesn't play it with just full-on overwhelming force. He looks at his opponents, analyzes their weak points, and strikes those first, bringing the enemy down much more quickly and more efficiently, with almost minimal loss of life to both his troops and the enemy. But then we get the biggest surprise that I wasn't even aware of. That Alfarius Omegon is actually a twin Primarch. That these are identical twins, Alfarius and Omegon. That they share one mind between each other, but two different bodies. They are essentially symbiotic, identical twins. And that right there caught me completely off guard. I might need to pick up some of the Alpha Legion books again sometime, so I could cover more of this Legion, because thus far, I know next to nothing about any of the Primarchs. I know about a lot of the different Chaos Space Marine factions, and I know a lot about a few of the Imperial Guard, but I know next to nothing about most of these legions, like the Alpha Legion, or the Imperial Fist, as I mentioned before. But, in all honesty, Alfarius was an interesting character, and I might want to pick up more of his book I'm going to look to see if he has a book in the Primarch series, and I'll get back to you all on that. But yeah, this one caught me off guard in a very pleasant way, and it was actually a very fascinating story to see different tactics being used here. But now, let's move on to the final story. And the final story of this anthology is Terminus by Chris Wraight, the key Primarch here being Mortarion, the Primarch of the Death Guard Legion of Space Marines. And in all honesty, Mortarion was a fascinating character, because from what I remember reading in this story, we actually see the corruption taking place. And this is actually happening during the Siege of Terra in this storyline. Like, the Death Guard is sieging on Terra, slowly marching to the Imperial Palace as they undergo the Great Change. Because at this point they have been demonized by chaos, especially by Nurgle, the chaos god of rot and petulance and disease. And we see these Marines essentially changing form, becoming corrupted, becoming diseased, lumbering like zombies almost. And we actually see two of these Marines, two of the Death Guard, essentially conversing about when was the last time they had seen Mortarion. And our main character recalls how he remembered seeing Mortarion briefly upon their ship within the warp, right before the Great Change started. And we see how they're questioning about what they do as the Death Guard, how they have endured some of the most insane missions and kept coming back alive. And Mortarion himself was actually a fascinating character. Like, the Death Guard describes themselves as having this hole, like something didn't feel right. And Mortarion was also probably the same way. But essentially, I feel like Mortarion's fall to Nurgle was pretty much inevitable at this point. From what I've heard of his backstory, where he grew up, it's kind of fitting that he would eventually fall to Nurgle. And during this, we actually see Mortarion descend in his Demon Primarch form, and that in itself was, like, just reading it aloud to myself as it was being described was absolutely a terrifying vision to behold. So in all honesty, Mortarion, all these Primarchs are very fascinating characters, but I really want to learn more about them. I might look more into the Primarch series just to get an idea of some of these characters and see how they grew up, their pasts, and everything else. Because this has given me a taste for it, and I might be eager for more. But this one being taken place during the Siege of Terra was very fun to read. And essentially with that last line of how what they do now, they say what we have always done. Endure. But anyway, guys, I would definitely recommend picking up this anthology if you are a fan of the Primarchs, or if you're interested in a nice little hardback on your shelf. Thank you all again for listening. Have an awesome day. This is Rambling Collector, signing off.